The UFA Super Series is heating up, and Free Friday Frisbee returns May 24th when the Minnesota Wind Chill travels to Stevens Field to battle the Madison Radicals. Two fierce Central Division rivals set to square off in front of the rowdy Radicals fans in the capital city of Ultimate. Join us for this next Super Series showdown, Minnesota at Madison, Friday, May 24th at 8 Eastern, 7 Central.
Welcome back. It's Swing Pass Week 5 preview pod coming at you. We've got 8 games to get to. I'm Adam Ruffner. That is Cameron Brock. We don't waste any time at the top of these shows, so let's start talking about the premier matchup coming up on this Memorial Day slate as we see a return of the league's Super Series matchup live and free on YouTube, with 2-1 Minnesota going to face the 2-0 Radicals at historic Stevens Field on Friday night. Both these teams kind of heading in opposite directions, as Minnesota faced a huge setback in last weekend's home opener against Pittsburgh, while the Radicals are sitting undefeated, but only having faced Pittsburgh and Detroit so far this season. The wind chill will certainly be a big test for the home team, but another Central Division team will also be facing a serious test as Chicago heads down to Texas to face Houston and Austin in their road doubleheader. The Saturday night matchup against the Soul will be the league's game of the week, featured on Watch UFA TV. There are 5 other matchups, including Philly at New York, Pittsburgh at Detroit and Toronto, San Diego at Salt Lake, and Portland at Seattle. But Cam, we've got a lot of Central Division action to talk about on this episode, so I'm going to be leaning heavily on you. Minnesota at Madison, you know a lot about both these teams. You know a lot about playing at Stevens Field. What do you expect for this big Super Series border battle showdown?
Well, it's one of those matchups that, especially I feel like when it's in Madison, it tends to not really matter how good either team is. It's just going to be one of those games that comes down to the fourth quarter. Last year when Madison was pretty down and Minnesota was, leading the top of the Central Division from start to finish, it was a battle. And for a long time, Madison was actually in control of that game until Minnesota finally seized some momentum, kind of like late in the third quarter, early in the fourth, and was able to go, run away with the win. But this game has produced a lot of interesting results over the years, and Madison, we don't really know what to think of them so far. They've looked great, but as you mentioned, those 2 games against Detroit and Pittsburgh, who have not been 2 of the cleanest teams in the league, who defensively have been 2 of the worst teams in the league, especially if you want to take away that Minnesota-Pittsburgh game out of the statistical it's kind of a statistical anomaly with all of the turns and everything else. You look at Pittsburgh's first 2 games, defensively they really struggled to force turnovers and to convert breaks. I think this game's going to tell us a little bit more about who Madison really is. And on the flip side, Minnesota has a very tough schedule this year, and they dropped a game, as we mentioned in our recap episode earlier this week, that they probably had put down in the back of their minds as a win already. And to lose a game like that to Pittsburgh, this means that there is really no room for error in the rest of their schedule. They need to make sure that they're taking advantage of every single divisional game right now. They have, games against New York and Colorado later on their schedule. Those aren't going to be easy games. There is no room for error for them. Minnesota really, it's weird to say this early, they need this win. Like, this isn't just hey, like, it's going to be a tough battle, we might win, we might lose. No. They need this game lest they start to, really kind of fall out of the playoff picture early, which is so weird to say out loud.
Yeah, I mean, it's about as must-win as you can have in Week 5 and just your 4th total matchup. But that's where the wind chills sit. And I think in talking with a few Minnesota members and your own experience too, kind of going through the grapevine, they 100% looked past Pittsburgh. They did not prepare for that matchup. And I'm really interested to see how they kind of respond this weekend. I know it's very much a different atmosphere, but given the fact that they took their eye off the ball, and that is some place historically where the wind chill franchise has struggled a bit. This is a franchise that has kind of fumble the gimme game here or there over the past several seasons. And so to see that kind of issue crop back up, it produces a lot of concern when you have Colorado's, rejuvenated Madison, New York, even you guys in Indy. That is never an easy matchup for the wind chill, especially with how you guys are kind of motivating yourselves this year. And so, this figures to be a big game for the 2-1 wind chill on the road. But to that point, Minnesota is 3-1 in their last 4 matchups since the beginning of 2021 at Madison specifically. And ever since they finally got the monkey off their back in 2019, winning their first ever game at that environment, at that stadium, it's kind of felt like the wind chill's game to have, as perplexingly as we may have it. Like, you guys have experienced that too in Indy, where you sort of flip the script after bashing your heads against the wall for so many seasons in that stadium. And now that it's reversed, what's that sort of like? What's it kind of like going into that Madison atmosphere, Capital City Ultimate, 1,500 to 2,000 fans, some of the most lively ones in the league, and being able to sort of fulfill a heel role? I feel like that's not a common role in this sport, but it's something that I think really energizes certain teams and players. What's your experience where you kind of get a feed off of, I don't know if I want to call it antipathy, but like, quieting the crowd, like letting them know that the road team is here to play?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that everyone handles differently. Like, for some people, going up to Madison is like, even after doing it multiple times, can be like scary, because the crowd is going to be so involved, and it's going to be one of those atmospheres where they're letting you hear about it too. I personally love it. Like, the louder somebody is heckling me, yelling at me, for me, that is like a prime source of motivation and focus. Like, I absolutely eat that up. I mean, my last 3 games at Breese Stevens Field have all been victories. The last 3 times I've gone up there, but before that, I was on a 12-game losing streak up there. So it is one of those things where it can be a mental hurdle, especially if it's something that's new to you. We play a sport where if you're a rookie in this league, you've never been into the Madison crowd, you're used to playing in front of friends and family, and that's about it. Maybe some people on the sidelines at your college tournaments or whatever else. Going into an atmosphere like Breese Stevens Field, like where you mentioned, you could have 1,500, 2,000 fans there. It's different. I mean, there's a different level of noise and pressure, and it can be a lot to deal with. Lucky for Minnesota, they do have a lot of experience on their roster, and a lot of them have experienced success at Breese Stevens, and I think they can draw on that as they head into this matchup. But for the younger players who either haven't been there before, or maybe this is only their second trip there, or what have you, it can still be a little intimidating. You need to go into an atmosphere like that with just a lot of confidence in yourself, and realizing that the more you're getting yelled at and heckled from the stands, it's sort of a sign of respect. They don't pick players out individually very often, unless it's somebody they're really trying to get to. And I think if you can kind of flip your mentality with that and to seeing it as kind of a good thing that they're picking on you, then that's great. But, some people crumble under the pressure in Madison. We've seen it. You mentioned Minnesota's 3-1 in their last 4 games there, but Minnesota's been the better team each of those 4 games. The fact that they dropped one tells you that maybe there is something still, maybe there's still a little magic in Breese Stevens Field, despite it not being quite as oppressive as it was, in the 2018 and before era. So I'm really excited. I'm sure Breese Stevens is going to be absolutely packed. College Nationals is going to be taking place there that weekend, so you're going to have a lot of Ultimate players in town. I'm expecting a huge crowd at that game. I believe this is following some games. Are there games earlier that day at Breese Stevens?
No, the semifinals and finals on Sunday and Monday will be held at Breese, but the rest of the college tournament bracket play will be held at Redden Soccer Complex.
There you go.
On the west side.
Yeah, so people will be in the area. I'm sure there'll be a lot of those players attending the games, the UFA game that night. It should be a really cool atmosphere. Great. This is a great game to be a part of the Super Series, to kind of show the world kind of what the UFA is about and the excitement that can be there. And I don't know, right now it's kind of hard. Minnesota's got some notable absences this weekend, and Madison.
I was gonna bring that up. Yeah, I was going to bring it up that one of the areas that I kind of wanted to focus on a little bit was both some of the reinsertions for Minnesota's lineup, which I think are important after being absent last weekend against Pittsburgh, as well as a couple of their notable performers who have particularly been key in victories at Madison. I think most notably, starting off with Sam Berglund, who will be out again with an injury. He was obviously a complete focal point for the defensive setup and attack last year when Minnesota got their first win at Madison. They got 2 victories at Breese-Stevens Field in 2023, but in their first matchup, Berglund was just pummeling that back line with his pulls. And I think we've talked about that strategy and importance for setting up the windshield defensive front and coverage system. Minnesota will also be without Jordan Taylor, who has been one of their key offensive starters and a connector piece between the backfield, sort of the continuation downfield play that the Winchell offense like to engage in. That figures to be a pretty significant loss given the struggles that the Minnesota offense has had so far and given their lack of consistency. However, Minnesota will be turning a cadre of very important starters, I think, headlined by Dylan DeClerc, who is absent from the Pittsburgh loss and has just been an absolute terror in these specific matchups at Madison. I think back to the 2021 return from pandemic game where he had 5 blocks and was just rampaging all over. And last year in the game of the week game there, he was diabolical and kind of the counterattack. And then also in their second victory, I'm remembering now, he had a couple of key late game blocks. So DeClerc in Madison, I think, to how you feel, loves playing in that environment. Colin Berry, who has been a captain for this team for several seasons, will be making his 2024 debut, as well as Marty Adams and Josh Klain will be active. They were both inactive in week 4. So those will be some pretty key additions. But we were talking in the pre-show, 3 players, young players in particular, still waiting to make their 2024 debut, and Will Brandt, Ian McCoskey, and Paul Krennick will not be available yet for the wind chill. And those are players that the away team figures could be really useful in this scenario. But I want to let you talk about what you might think is the most significant absence. And then on the flip side, you were just saying Madison looking at full strength, maybe for the first time in a few seasons. I mean, ever since that 2018 championship year, this Radicals team has struggled to stay healthy and as a full unit on the field. And you look at their active lineup, it is kind of their most optimal formation for their 2024 roster right now.
Yeah, I think Minnesota, the obvious one for me, is a guy who hasn't played yet. Like, the fact that Will Brandt isn't on the field yet is absolutely huge. He is their best offensive weapon. He is a rangy handler who is incredibly hard to double team due to his length. He can make all the throws. He's really matured as a decision maker. I think last year he took a huge leap forward in just his processing and decision making as the game went on. He used to be a player you could kind of count on to make a few mistakes throughout the game, and that just really wasn't the case last year. With all of the roller pulling and double teaming that teams have really fallen in love with over the last couple seasons with the rule change to the pulls, he's just invaluable as a guy who can pick up that disc on the sideline and be completely unfazed and unbothered by a couple of people standing around him. Now for Madison, you're right. This is pretty much the optimal lineup for this season. They looked really good in their first game against Pittsburgh, where they had pretty close to an optimal lineup as well. Their deep game really kind of took off. They've struggled in the deep game basically since Kai Marcus went down with an injury in 2022. Basically the rest of that season and then all of last year, the deep game was very hit or miss. It's kind of been reignited. I think that they're just going to be a little bit more explosive on offense, and that's really where they've been let down over the last couple of seasons. There's just been no consistency and really no deep threat. You could kind of just sit under and kind of force them to work through, 15, 20, 25 throws to score because there just wasn't much of a deep game going for them. I think with Kai Marcus back. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, and especially against Minnesota, that's death. I mean, the wind chill features some of the best lane poaching and just reading defenders in the leagues, most notably in Dylan DeClercq. But I mean, Brandon Mattis, Brett Bergmeyer, their whole defensive unit kind of keys in on those mid-range passes. And I just feel like that's been so evident in this particular matchup between these two teams.
Yeah, and one of the big things that Madison's going to have to do defensively, switching to their side of the disc, is stop the counterattack. I've said this. I believe I said it on this show. I know I've said it like with my teammates and coaches. Minnesota, when they get a turnover, they want to score within 3 throws. And ideally, they want to score within 2. If you force their D-line to complete more than 3 passes, their chances of breaking go astronomically lower than if they are scoring within 3 throws. And that sounds like really stupid, like really oversimplified, but it's the truth. They want to shoot it deep as quickly as possible. So, and sometimes that's literally right off of getting the D. It's the first throw. Madison needs to stop that from happening. Turns are going to happen, but can you keep that turnover from becoming an immediate score? Make Minnesota work the disc when they force a turnover, and you're going to see drastically different results in terms of their break percentage. It's pretty obvious too. You go watch the Chicago game. There were multiple times where Minnesota got a turn, and Chicago made no attempt to put on a flat mark, try to stop the Huck. And sure enough, Huck goes up immediately. And next thing you know, Minnesota has scored, or they're right on the goal line waiting to complete one more pass.
Yeah, and to your point, Minnesota averaged 10 breaks a game in their 2 games at Breese Stevens last year, which is just way too many to surrender. And honestly, it's pretty impressive that Madison was even close in those games, given those kinds of defensive scoring opportunities. And on the flip side, I actually think Madison's defense has been able to be pretty effective against the wind chill offense. And right now, I'm kind of back at that point where without Brandt, without some kind of X factor in that unit, and with Brian Vanuka looking possibly injured or like his first step isn't quite where it is, this Minnesota offense just lacks an ability to, what we've kind of talked about with New York, take the top off. Even with Matt Rader in that lineup, there's a little bit of hesitancy in really getting good, consistent, in-rhythm looks. I was actually talking with one of their players this week about how it feels like their offense is built around quick continuation throws, getting it to Jordan Taylor, getting it to Bevon, kind of shooting upfield immediately to that next player deep. And right now they're getting discs and they're making multiple reads. They're kind of working through a progression and then resetting and losing whatever gainer they just made. And without there being a consistent deep attack or a little bit more speed and getting into their rhythm, there's just a lot of places where you can stall and halt this Minnesota offense, which is exactly what Minnesota's defense loves to do, Madison's defense loves to do with traps and double teams and just kind of stunting whenever you don't keep moving the disc on them.
Yeah, without Jordan Taylor too, you talked about the continuation game. That's kind of his bread and butter, so it's like missing one of those pieces. Adding Colin Berry helps with the speed and explosiveness, and he is a player who's not afraid to shoot it deep, because you kind of had this weird thing going on in their lineup, right? Where with Matt Rader, he can be this incredible deep threat, but outside of Josh Klain, there was really nobody on the field that you think is really actually going to put it deep. So, when Tristan Van Der Mertel gets the disc, it's pretty much a shock anytime the disc goes more than 20 yards downfield. And in fact, a Huck he tried to throw last week, granted it was very windy, went out of bounds. It's the first time I feel like I've ever seen him try to throw the disc down the field, and results weren't great. So it's where does Matt Rader really fit in this lineup when you don't have people who are going to be shooting it deep to him? Well, with Klain back this week, with Colin Berry in the lineup, who's definitely not afraid to shoot it deep, that does add a second thrower that maybe we can look to see if that continuation game could go. I could easily see Colin Berry coming under, grabbing multiple discs throughout the course of this game and seeing Raiders streaking deep. And, Raider versus anyone, you probably take Raider 98% of the time. So not the worst matchup to be throwing deep to. We saw the play a few weeks ago in Chicago where there was a group of 6 guys and Matt Rader just kind of made them all look very small and very unimportant when that disc was in the air. So you see him in some one-on-one matchups. I'll be curious to see if they try to take advantage of any of those, because I don't think there's really a defender that Madison's going to be able to throw at Raider that's going to really be able to bother him in that way. But if they can't get that bridge, that gap from backfield to midfield to further down the field, like you said, and they're forced to make multiple reads, their offense stagnates pretty badly. And that's where we have seen a lot of their turns come, especially in that Chicago game. If we're talking about a more normal weather game, their turns came when the offense kind of got stunted out, or when they tried to force a deep look from the backfield, like fairly early in the possession, instead of working it and letting something develop.
I would kind of like to see Minnesota lean a little bit on Raider in this. You know, he's had some of his best career games in that specific stadium, thinking back to the 2016 semifinal with Seattle, thinking back to 2019 when he played with Chicago, coming in and getting a couple of key late fourth quarter blocks in a road win for the then, I think they were still the Wildfire that season.
They were.
You know, like, he can be somebody who I'd like to see them get a little bit more involved. And in the chaos of last weekend, I actually thought he had a pretty good game for them. But to your point, with Klain not being in the lineup, they just didn't really have a bunch of throwers who could get him the ball, so to speak. And I know you hate this kind of intervention, but I wonder if it's kind of time to implement Babbitt in Boston and bring Raider a little bit more back into the backfield and let him get more touches and just let him get a little bit more of a feel and a little bit more of an established presence on the field, and then work from there. I know it's a little bit regressive for an athlete as imposing as a Raider, but given Minnesota's struggles, maybe just getting touches to ostensibly their best player is just a simple solution for them.
Yeah, I think it depends on what you do with it, right? Like, I don't like what I've been seeing with Boston, where it's like Babbitt just back there for like 5 throws in a row and really creating nothing upfield. But one thing you can do as an athlete who's in the backfield, who really wants to be pushing deep downfield, is one of the best places to make a deep cut from is the handler space. I scored on a goal this past weekend when I was in the handler space and dished it, and just it gave me more room to take off and more room to create separation. And if you're doing something like that, I love it, because you're creating forward momentum for your team. If he's just sitting back there throwing resets over and over again, don't love it quite as much, even if you are getting the touches, because I like the idea of getting a disc in your hand just so it's not like you're going multiple possessions without touching it. But if you're just sitting back there and it's just like you're just kind of moving it laterally back and forth, then I think it can get to the point where it is stagnant. You're kind of, a square peg, round hole in the backfield, where you could be doing something more valuable somewhere else.
Yeah, and to your point about kind of ramping up from the backfield, I don't know that there's a better deep cutter with a long runway than Raider.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned the play that he made against Chicago. He basically ran a wheel route 5 yards in front of the handler's set. That was a very long drag cut that he ran vertically.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, to your point, yeah, I don't want to see him sort of plant himself in the backfield. I just think that using him as maybe an offside swing and allowing him again to sort of bring a defender back there and then make it a foot race downfield could be very advantageous for the away team. But we got to move on to some other stuff. I want to finish on who you got in this matchup. I know we haven't been doing a whole bunch of picks, but I got to ask, who's your edge in Minnesota and Madison?
This is hard just because, as we mentioned, we haven't really seen Madison face like an upper echelon team yet. But with all the absences Minnesota has, with it being on the road, with probably the added people that are going to be in the stadium, like all of the intangible factors of the crowd noise and the home field and stuff like that, I got to give the edge to Madison. Now, like I said, in the past, it hasn't really mattered what lineups either team has brought out. So despite all these absences from Minnesota, they could still make a game of this and win this game. But I think, honestly, the big ones, Brandt and then Berglund, like not having Berglund there for the polls, and also he's a lot of times the main person throwing to DeClercq when they do get the disc on those deep shots. Not having Will Brandt still, I got to give the edge to Madison, who's at full strength and has looked really good this year so far.
Yeah, I'll totally concur with you there. I think I got to give the slight edge to Madison, but man, if I were setting lines, I think I would set it at a single point for the home team right now.
For
But
sure.
it's also a little bit of recency bias, I'll admit, for how Minnesota performed last weekend. They always play up in Breeze Stevens' environment, and I really can't wait to be there live, helping cover it, because
Jealous.
I've said this before on this podcast. The season doesn't always really kick in for me personally until I get that first in-person game.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just couldn't be more excited for this Memorial Day weekend showing. But we should move on to the other Central Division team facing some pretty key matchups in Chicago's Texas two-step, again, at Houston on Friday and then at Austin on Saturday. The two Texas teams are so far combined 4-1 on the season. Chicago enters the weekend 1-1 and really figuring to need to at least split this so that they don't drop to 1-3 immediately, especially with, we'll get to this a little bit later in the episode, Pittsburgh may be able to pick up two very significant wins in their home and away doubleheader in week 5.
Yeah. Chicago's looks like they're basically at full strength. They don't have Goldenberg yet, who has yet to appear for Chicago. I think he is going to be a big boost to them in the backfield. Joe White, before the season, I had heard that Joe White was supposed to be, like, this was going to be 2 of the games he was definitely going to be at, not rostered. Starting to make me think if he is actually going to make an appearance. Is he just sitting on the roster right now and never going to be actually put into a game? But this is certainly a weekend they could have used him, not just for how great of a player he is. Also, he has experience playing against Austin and Houston. Like, he played in Carolina last year. He's played against these teams, at least against Carolina, definitely against Austin at least. And yeah, like, while Austin and Chicago is the game of the week, it is the definitely more difficult matchup of the two for Chicago. They really can't go into Houston and overlook them. I would hate for this to be a situation for them where they kind of go in with the focus on Austin and look past a Houston team that, you know, I mean, the only team they've beaten so far is Dallas. They did get absolutely crushed by Austin in their only other game. But I mean, they have some playmakers. Like, they're not devoid of talent. They're not a team that's just going to, like, roll over. And it is a home game for Houston. It's a long travel for Chicago, and Chicago's look pretty rough offensively in their game against Minnesota. They were only able to manage 6 goals in the second half of that game and only 14 total. So it's usually pretty windy down there in these Texas games. They struggled in a semi-windy environment in their first game. I'm a little worried for their offense and what that's going to look like.
Yeah, and to your point, in their last 4 games dating back to last year against non-Detroit opponents, Chicago is averaging under 15 a game, which is just not a number that correlates very well with winning in this league.
Yeah.
And to your point about Houston on Friday night, I feel like that could be a real stress test for the Union and a really interesting stylistic matchup. I think Houston has enough big bodies and team speed to challenge some of the more established defensive principles of the Chicago team. You know, we talk about sort of how the Central plays a different style of defense with a lot more trapping and double teams and just sort of stunting than almost any other division. And I think that that's going to be really interesting to see against a team that's just in its second year in this league in Houston. But to that point, I think if the Havoc can isolate some one-on-one matchups, get some good looks for Jimmy Zura to engage a Ben Lewis downfield, I think that they could find a good deal of success, which would then really put Chicago on its heels if they lose on Friday night to then go face an Austin team that's 2-0 and looking to kind of, I think, make a statement game against the Union. You know, Austin lost their first and only matchup against Chicago back in 2022. It was kind of the first, I think, true year of this ascending Austin team becoming a true contender. And I think that this is kind of the next episode in the saga where the Soul want to crush. Mm-hmm. You know, you see that against Houston too. Like, the Havoc hung around for a couple of quarters, and then it was just the brake train rolling for the Soul team throughout the second half. And I could see a very similar result for Chicago if that offense isn't mindful of how explosive the Seoul defense can be. And while the Seoul defense will be down 2 defensive starters and 2 key elements of their D-line counterattack in Matt Armour and Elliott Moore, there's still more than enough production for Austin to really make this game kind of run away if the Union aren't careful.
Well, and like you said, the amount of goals scored by Chicago against non-Detroit opponents, under 15 a game. Austin is stout on defense. They're athletic, and their offense is explosive. I can't see them holding this Austin team to anything below 20. And I just don't know how Chicago gets to 20. And you mentioned that game in 2022. Austin was actually in control most of that game. That was a game that Austin built a lead, looked like they were in control, and just slowly just kind of let Chicago take over the game and come back and win. But this is a different Austin team. This team seems so far, now granted they've only played against Houston and Dallas, but they're playing with so much more assertiveness and so much more like they're playing like they're the champions of that division, which is what they were last year. But this year, it's like they're playing with that level of confidence and surety that they haven't played with in the past. It's also the second day of a Texas two-step. So I don't hold out a lot of hope that Chicago is going to have a lot of success in that second game. I think as rough as they've looked on offense so far, I'm really keying in on that Houston matchup because, like you said, Houston can definitely disrupt a little bit with their team speed and big bodies. I think one thing that can actually work to Houston's advantage, they sometimes can play a little loose with the disc. And I think against a Chicago team that really tries to contain teams and keep them from shooting deep, it might, I think actually Houston kind of counteracting that and kind of directly attacking that could actually work out for Houston. A lot of the teams in the Central don't necessarily test Chicago deep as much, but we did see in the Minnesota game a few times, it's almost like they expect the other team not to throw it deep because they're positioned that way. And then when it happens, they're not prepared to react to the fact that they actually attack them deep. Saw multiple times that they were vulnerable on a turnover. Chicago's offense not getting back on defense always quickly enough. So definitely a place Houston could take advantage of them. I do think Chicago is the more talented team. I think that if they go in there with a lot of focus and intentionality, they should come out as winners in that game. But I don't think it's so much so that Houston can't sneak one here. So Chicago needs to be very careful and very intentional in that game and not be looking past them because they could easily come out 0-2 if they do that.
Well, and so let's set the larger picture here for the Central Divisions because we've sort of touched on their big weekend that's coming up. You know, Minnesota at Madison, Chicago at Houston, at Austin, and then the other piece to this whole kind of pie is Pittsburgh's home and away doubleheader. They host Detroit, and then they go to Toronto. Both their opponents haven't won a game this season. And so the Thunderbirds, having picked up that crucial win at Minnesota, could really position themselves favorably, particularly if they get some help from the home teams. And you have Minnesota at 2 losses. You have Chicago at 3 losses. And suddenly you would have a Central Division playoff picture that looks like 3-0 Madison, followed by 3-1 Pittsburgh.
Yep.
Now, a lot could still happen in the back 8 games of their schedule, but given where I think we all saw the T-Birds coming into this season, they could really, I think, smear a few of our noses in it as far as their competitiveness and just ability to win the games in front of them, which is clearly proving to be a little bit of a challenge in the Central Division this season.
Yeah, I mean, we'll still have only played 2 games at the end of this week, so we'll just be sitting there at 1-1. And yeah, it's really interesting. I think I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that Detroit game, while I certainly favor Pittsburgh, I think it's going to be closer than probably we anticipate. I think, like you said, kind of maybe overreacting a little bit to Minnesota's performance last week and letting that recency bias kick in to maybe how we're viewing this Madison game. I think you can do it the opposite way for Pittsburgh. Like, hey, they just beat Minnesota, but like they beat a Minnesota team down a lot of starters and in some crazy weather where I think like a lot of weird stuff went on, and it's just like, well, how much did that say about
they
Pittsburgh?
got a W.
They did, but I don't know what that tells me about Pittsburgh. I don't know how good they are because they got that win. Because honestly, Minnesota. I don't know.
I don't know. We saw this with Chicago last year where they might have not been the third best team by the end of the year, but they had 6 wins and occupied the 3rd seed. Like they got to the playoffs.
And they beat Minnesota and Minnesota, much like Pittsburgh just did.
Yeah. Maybe that's the real keystone piece to these sort of upstarts, right?
I don't know.
At Seafoam.
Pittsburgh just looked so non-competitive in their first 2 games of the season that I just don't know where the balance point is for like those 2 games versus their game up in Minnesota. I don't know where to like position them. I don't know how to think about them. I know defensively they haven't looked great in their first 2 games of the season. This game's in Pittsburgh. I don't anticipate the weather being a huge factor in this. I think this game is going to be closer than it maybe people think it's going to be. I still think Pittsburgh comes out on top. There's no reason for me to think otherwise. But they go up to Toronto next day. Like you mentioned, Toronto hasn't gotten a win. Toronto's last game, they just lost against a team who hadn't won in more than a calendar year. So Toronto's kind of like reeling and trying to figure out where they're going to be at in this whole Eastern shakeup where them and Philly right now kind of sitting at the bottom winless. And, you know, if Toronto's looking to pick up a win, might be one of their better opportunities, playing a Pittsburgh team on the second day of a back-to-back at home. But yeah, I mean, like you said, they could come out of this weekend with 2 more wins. They could be 3-2 after this weekend. And with the way things have shaken out so far, it might just be, you mentioned Chicago last year, 6 wins got them into the playoffs. Maybe it's a race to 6 wins to get a playoff spot in the Central. I don't really know. But that certainly puts Pittsburgh in a nice position where they're halfway there by the end of this weekend.
So in the final part of this episode, we've kind of talked about a lot of teams needing a win on this Memorial Day weekend. And I wanted to present a slate of opponents and have you pick which team would benefit most from a W in week 5. Is it Minnesota at Madison as we set up that scenario? Is it Chicago down in Texas? Is it Pittsburgh? Or is it a couple of teams we haven't quite brought up yet? 0-3 Philadelphia at 3-1 New York. Phoenix looking to avoid another disastrous winless start to their season for what feels like the 3rd straight year. Or also 2-2 San Diego at 5-0 Salt Lake, which might feel like a bit of a stretch given how the Shred are playing. But the Growlers were very close to them just a couple weekends ago in San Diego. And the Growlers added KJ Koo, who has been a pretty big X factor for LA over spot starts the past couple of years. The Growlers have been talking all week about making the Shred matchup a big calendar item for them, and they really feel like they can vault off of it. I know I'm kind of almost angling towards that as your response, but of the kind of games proposed, which of those teams could stand to benefit the most from a victory?
So I'm actually not going to go San Diego, simply because they have 6 games left against Oakland, Seattle, and LA, and they would be completely fine if they don't win this game, as long as they're able to take care of business and win like maybe 4 out of those 6 matchups with the other teams that they're really fighting for that last playoff spot with. So that schedule for me plays a big factor into all of this. Pittsburgh needs to win, but these are not games that I think, especially their first game, should not. I don't want to say a foregone conclusion because we thought that about maybe Minnesota and Pittsburgh last week, but maybe as close to a foregone conclusion as you can get in game 1. And I think that they're pretty well positioned to win the second game. The team that really needs this the most is Minnesota, and it is because of the schedule. If Chicago goes down and drops some games, it's not good, but they're out of division games. They can still come back to the Central, and they can wrap up head-to-head tiebreakers against every team in the division if they take care of business, right? Whereas if Minnesota loses this game to Madison, that drops them to 2 losses in the division. They still have games against Colorado and New York coming up later in the season. It feels very treacherous for them if this happens. Like they only have 1 game against Indy, and it's in Indy. I mean, they're just like a slew of things with their schedule. If Minnesota drops this, it's not like they can't make the playoffs. We're not going to jump to that conclusion quite yet. But they go from being a team who maybe was at the beginning of the season hoping to wrap up home field advantage, and now it maybe does get to the point where they're just trying to make sure they make the playoffs. And a loss here would put, Madison would be up at what, 2 or 3-0, with a head-to-head advantage at them at the time. It just wouldn't look good for them. Minnesota needs it the most.
I'm almost hearing, reading through the lines there, though, that Madison might actually benefit the most because they would be at the top of the division.
Essentially, yeah.
Looking down again for the first time in what feels like an eon. But that'll have to do it for this episode of Swing Pass. The Week 5 preview pod has concluded, but you can still tune in for all the action live and returning on YouTube with the Super Series matchup between Minnesota and Madison, as well as all of the games available on Watch UFA TV. Cam and I will be back with you in just a couple of days. Talk to you soon. Bye now.
Madison, Wisconsin, the capital city of ultimate.
There's no doubt the crowd and energy and that momentum is contagious when you're on the road, right?
We have a little bit of an experience here, and we've taken care of this team a couple of times in the past.
Skying through the contact for the score.
Like it was nothing.
He was off.
Oh my gosh!
That's a Callahan by Andrew Mechanic to tie the game.
Goodness. Are you kidding me?
This would be a gigantic moment for Madison.